Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Today's webinar discussion will focus on pay equity in 2022 with David Cohen, Joanna Colosimo, and Lisa Harp from DCI Consulting Group. My name is Angel Fisher, and I'm the Senior Product Marketing Manager here at Circa, and will be moderating today's webinar. First, I'd like to start with a very quick webinar 101. You will notice a GoToWebinar panel on your screen. To minimize this panel, simply click on the orange rectangle, and please feel free to type in any questions that you have into the question box, and we will answer as many generalized questions as possible at the end of today's presentation during our live Q&A session. You will be muted the whole time, so I do invite you to please fill in your questions into the question box. Additionally, I do want to note that we are recording this presentation, and we will share the on-demand version with you along with your HRCI and SHRM accreditation in an email follow-up that will be sent this week. For those listening via internet, please keep in mind that hardwired connections are recommended instead of wireless connections to ensure the best sound quality. If this is your first time joining a Circa webinar, we would like to give you a little bit of information about who we are. Circa is a catalyst for companies to build high-performing, diverse teams based on research that shows companies want to shift from diversity as a program to diversity as a business strategy. We were founded in 1994, have over 4,000 federal contractors as customers, over 15,000 community partner relationships, and a network of over 600 online employment websites. We have HRCI and SHRM accredited webinars every month on OFCCP and diversity-related topics. We have a weekly publication of our OFCCP Digest. At circaworks.com, we have our Ask the Experts forum with industry leaders to help you all with your OFCCP and business needs. We're proud members of the ILG and AAA ED. We sponsor and speak at several OFCCP and diversity-related conferences nationally, and have a Circa blog on our website with thought leadership tied to compliance and diversity-related topics. Please do keep in mind that our presentation gives generalized information and is not intended in any way as legal advice. You should always consult a lawyer about your particular situation, as this information may not be applicable to you. And now I do have the great pleasure of introducing today's speakers. David Cohen is the founder and president of DCI Consulting Group. He provides consulting services to employers and management law firms on a wide range of human resource risk management strategies, particularly in the areas of EEO and affirmative action program development, systemic compensation statistical analysis, comprehensive human resources self-audits, diversity and inclusion metrics, and employee selection and test validation. David is also on the board of directors for Circa. Joanna Colosimo is the Vice President of Workforce Equity and Compliance Strategy at DCI Consulting, where she leads a division of IO psychologists, advanced HR practitioners, and analysts who consult with organizations on OFCCP compliance requirements, pay equity solutions, audit strategies, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. Joanna has extensive experience working with Fortune 1000 clients to conduct and interpret complex adverse impact, utilization, diversity, and systemic pay equity and analytics in the equal employment opportunity context. Lisa Hart, PhD, is an industrial psychologist and director of selection and assessment, principal consultant in the Employment and Litigation Services Division at DCI Consulting Group. In this role, Dr. Harp assists companies in the evaluation of fairness of their employment practices. This includes statistical and qualitative analysis of hiring, performance appraisal, compensation, and promotion practices, as well as coordination with attorneys and employers involved in discrimination litigation or Office of Federal Contract Compliance Program OFCCP audits. She brings 20 years of experience in industrial psychology and statistical analysis. And now I will turn it over to David to get us started.
Hey, Angel, thanks so much. Appreciate it. Thanks to Circa. Always love partnering and doing these webinars. So just quickly, and then we'll get into the meat of things. Just quickly about DCI, as kind of Angel introduced us. We do a lot of work in this space that we're going to talk about today. I was thinking about this last night. I think between the three of us, we probably have over 70 years combined of doing pay equity and workforce analytics. So this is something that we don't dabble in. This is something that we do a lot of and work with a lot of very large employers, actually from all size employers on these issues. So just quickly about DCI, we always like to talk about our mission, advancing the workforce equity and organizational effectiveness through our dynamic client partnerships. And we really do, partner with our clients on a whole range of services. If you go to the next slide, just quickly, and Angel talked about the service offerings that we provide at DCI, from affirmative action plans to DE&I metrics and programs to pay equity. I think we probably do more pay equity analytics than really any firm out there, and it's something that we've been doing for well over 20 years as a firm. Lisa, is involved in a lot of selection and validation work. And then we also work as experts in class action litigation. And actually, one of the goals of today is to not need our services for class action litigation or anything like that. And it really is all about being proactive. So let's go to the next slide. And our first question is for participants. Has your organization ever conducted a proactive pay equity analysis? This is anonymous. We won't get any information. We're just trying to gauge from the audience who has some experience doing these analyses, because that's really what we're going to get to, is kind of framing it, setting it up, and then kind of talking about how to do a study.
So David, I wanted to share some of the poll results with you. So 68% have said yes, 20% no, and 11% are unsure.
Perfect. And a lot, it's the unsure. A lot of times these analyses are done in a different department, and a lot of times even HR professionals are not aware what's being done. We're going to get into transparency as part of this. So let's get into it. Let's go to the next slide, please. Kind of just what we're going to talk about, why care about this. Some of this is pretty self-explanatory, why you're going to care about it. We're going to get into this ESG reporting, and Joanna's going to spend some time talking about, if you're not familiar with ESG, what that is and why you should start thinking about that. Because if you're not thinking about it, trust me, your shareholders are, your employees are, your customers are, potential investors are, applicants, things like that. Then Lisa's going to spend some time talking about the laws. We're not going to spend a lot of time, but we're just going to frame it in the context of pay equity, not only at the federal level, state level, and folks, there's a lot of action at the state level. And then we'll kind of finish up with proactive analytics, how to do it. Probably each one of these topics we can spend a day on. So we're just going to cover them at a high level. And then Joanna's going to finish off with really probably a part of the process that most employers skip is after they do a proactive pay equity study, and let's say they find inequities, they'll make salary adjustments, but they don't take that a step further to do what we call the root cause analysis. Why are those inequities occurring, and how do you fix that? So we'll spend a little time on that. Next slide, please. I'm going to serve as your moderator. We've got two really fantastic experts. So I'll keep us on track. I'll frame the conversation, but Joanna and Lisa are going to take most of the presentation. So, we start off with why care about it. Like I said, it's pretty self-explanatory. Most of you are here because you believe that it's the right thing to do. And when we work with our clients, I mean, that's what we do. And we start with like, this is something that every employer should be doing. You should be going into this wide-eyed, and if there are problems, you want to address them and fix them. So, start with it's the right thing to do. Second, you know, we talked about already, beyond kind of your company's walls, there are a lot of stakeholders who want to know what you're doing, how you're doing it. We're going to talk about that. And these public disclosures, and if you're not disclosing and transparent, you may be forced to do that. We'll kind of set that up in a little bit. And then, pay equity must be a part of a DEIA assessment. Whether you're doing a racial equity audit or just a proactive assessment, pay equity must be a part of that project plan. Obviously, you want to limit your risk. If you're a federal contractor, you need to think about OFCCP. If you're not a federal contractor, you still need to think about potential litigation. We'll kind of touch on that a little bit. And then down to the state level. The states are really active right now on pay equity and reporting. And we'll kind of spend some time talking about that. Just a little note, once the EEOC gets a majority, the Democrats get a majority, one of the major initiatives, actually right now, EEOC is having a public hearing to discuss whether or not the government should reinstate a federal pay reporting. I think it's going to happen, and I think it's just a matter of time. So next slide. Once again, I'm just going to move through this quickly. This is where you don't want to be. You don't want to be a headline. And these are big numbers, 175 million, 118 million. These cases take a really long time. Full disclosure, the Signet class action case, we served as experts in that case. And it was a long case. So that's why you're all here. You want to avoid that. And just the last thing is, right, we all saw in the news, congratulations to the women's soccer team. It was a long, hard fight. Just a little background, I was at the game a couple weeks ago where the women played Nigeria. They won, and then they really won at the end of the game. They had a ceremony with the signing of the new collective bargaining agreement where they are going to get equal pay with the men's team, and there were representatives from the men's team there congratulating the women. So it was a historic moment. So let's kind of get started, and we're talking about public pay disclosures. Joanna, why are companies doing it, and what are they disclosing?
Yeah, great question, Dave. So if we talk about the big picture, first and foremost, there's been just this increasing pressure for companies to come forth and be transparent about their pay equity initiatives. And really, we've all been in this space for either multiple decades or a few decades. So I've noticed this in the past 10 years, this push for public pay disclosures. And it's not new, but we're seeing large organizations, and the examples on your screen are for Bank of America, Starbucks, kind of coming forward. They're not publishing a pay equity study per se, but they are highlighting their policies, their procedures, their view of equal pay for equal work, and in their commitment statements and their diversity statements. Or if you look at the bottom right-hand screen of your screen, you'll see a wage gap number, and we'll talk about that in a moment, where organizations are disclosing what they're seeing with pay equity, at a global macro level. And there's just a ton of reasons for it. One, it's that shareholder pressure that we've been talking about for many years. Two, there's employee pressure as well. We're seeing more and more employees pushing on their employers to have a little bit more transparency and public commitment on their commitment to pay equity. Three, we're seeing more pressure not only from shareholders, but investors, different types of investors. We're seeing just in the public forum. You know, if you want to win business, you know, we're seeing new business ask organizations for information about their pay equity policies. So there's a lot of compelling reasons to disclose something about an organization's commitment to pay equity, whether that becomes a wage gap number, that becomes a policy, that becomes a statement, or some other metric in some other forum. If we go to the next slide, though, I'd love to talk a little bit about that concept because we started the conversation, Dave, we started the conversation with pay equity and equal pay for equal work. But when we talk about public disclosures, we don't necessarily see all of the details and all, you know, how the sausage is made when it comes to pay equity itself. So it's really important before we even start this conversation to tee up what's the difference between a pay gap or a wage gap and that concept of pay equity. So probably many of us are familiar with news clippings on macro level statistics about the pay gap or the wage gap. You know, women earn 81 cents to the dollar as compared to men. That's a macro level statistic. And in fact, a pay gap, whether it's at a global level or a macro level or at an organizational level, is really just an overarching kind of crude macro level statistic. It's really looking at, on average, what do men make compared to women, or vice versa, what do women make compared to men, depending on how you're looking at the ratio. Or we can apply that to other frameworks for race or ethnicity. So there might be the intersectionality. What do Black women make on average compared to white men? Or what do Black workers make on average to white workers? On overall, on average. Typically, a pay gap isn't getting to the nuance of the difference of each job or other, you know, merit-based factors. It really is an average comparison of wages. When we talk about pay equity, we get to a little bit more nuance. It's really asking, you know, are there pay differences between men and women or certain race and ethnicity groups? When we're actually talking about comparing similarly situated workers and accounting for those merit-based factors, accounting for those job-related factors. So it's getting it's way more nuanced to talk about pay equity than the overarching pay gap statistic. I think that's important to say because a lot of times we listen to the news. Even when I was in graduate school and getting passionate about this space, I'd hear statistics like, oh, women make 81 cents to the dollar that men make. That's not fair. But there's more nuance to that when we get into pay equity. There's a lot more that organizations have to uncover to understand why that might be with that overall pay gap statistic.
Yeah, Joanne, I think a big takeaway for everyone on this is, and it's not very intuitive, but companies who are doing these public disclosure wage gap analyses need to also conduct a pay equity study, because you could have perfect parity. Your wage gap could be, you know, women earn, perfect parity to men and the wage gap, but there could be pay equity problems, and we've seen that. So just the takeaway to everybody, just because you do these public disclosures and it's, you know, 1 cent to the dollar, you know, 99 cents to the dollar or perfect parity, you still need to conduct a pay equity study using regression, looking at similarly situated jobs, because there could be differences. So I think that's important. And Lisa, if we go to the next slide, right? The one thing to also talk about, because some of these public disclosures, right, show this unadjusted gap and this adjusted gap. So, you know, to Joanna's point, you know, women in the country make 83 cents to the dollar that a man earns, but, you know, adjusted, maybe that's 96 cents. What does that mean?
Yeah, good question, David. And I think that this is one thing that I really wish there was more transparency by the companies who are publishing these wage gap numbers on this issue of unadjusted versus adjusted. So Joanna's comment that, you know, we see that national statistic of women make 81 cents on the dollar to men. That's an unadjusted wage gap. So that's just average female pay compared to average male pay, period. Doesn't control for anything. But, and so, you know, you may wonder, well, we see, gosh, Bank of America's dollar for dollar, Starbucks is right up there. How is that possible, given that nationally there's this 20-cent, you know, wage gap? And it's because those companies are publishing what's called an adjusted pay gap. And so you can actually use a regression technique to control for things like job, location, different kind of structural variables to get to kind of that adjusted after controlling for those, what's the difference? And so you are rarely going to see currently any companies publishing that unadjusted wage gap because it's often not as flattering. But they will publish that adjusted wage gap. And where I think that I would love to see more transparency, though, is one, the difference between the two, but at least some information on what are they controlling for, because we don't know. And you may have one company control for job, another company may control for job and location, another company may control for job, location, performance, tenure, and 10 other variables, because the goal for some of these companies is to get that gap as small as possible before publicly disclosing it. And so I think that the adjusted wage gap can be informative, but I also think it can be particularly informative if we look at it compared to the unadjusted, which really is going to be very reflective of the distribution of women, for example, in the organization.
Yeah, and I think, Lisa, to your point, public disclosure was not something that was very common years ago. And then you had some of these activist shareholder groups like Arjuna Capital and others that were kind of pressuring employers to release the information. Employers then were releasing these adjusted wage gaps. And now you're seeing some of these shareholder groups are saying, we want you to publish both your unadjusted and your adjusted. Let's go to the next slide, because kind of keeping on the theme of transparency and reporting, like I said, historically employers wouldn't release anything related to their diversity numbers or their pay numbers. You're seeing more employers do that. We're in the midst right now where the Center for Investigative Reporting is via a FOIA request, Freedom of Information request, asking OFCCP to turn over all federal contractors' consolidated EEO-1 reports. So people are interested in looking under the hood and looking at your diversity numbers, your pay numbers, as Joanna said, really outside of your company. And I think that we're seeing this expanding to other initiatives. So Joanna, talk us through that. What are we seeing?
Yeah, great question. I'll just read the tea leaves here. I mean, transparency is here to stay when it comes to pay reporting. Again, what type of pay reporting I'd love to dig into in the next few slides, but transparency is here to stay when it comes to divulging diversity and representation data. I do think that's the next decade. That's where the 2020s are going. But for the last few years, we're seeing the regulators, push on increased requirements for disclosure. And now we have this FOIA request that Dave talked about. Of course, the government didn't put the FOIA requests together, but they're the vehicle for fulfilling the FOIA request for those EEO-1 Type 2 reports. SEC reporting on human capital change, if anybody has to report those 10K reports. Right. I recently just did a project where we saw this spike in terms of where those 10K human capital reports are coming. We're seeing more and more information being disclosed by large organizations on those, especially since 2020, where organizations, okay, yeah, we will, we're going to disclose our diversity numbers, partly because it's SEC, mandated, and also partly because the organizations are feeling comfortable being more transparent because they're getting pressure from other areas of the world. So the workforce, employees, shareholders, we already talked about it. The press is pushing on organizations. I've seen the press in the last 5, 6, 7 years actually challenge organizations' pay gap number that Lisa discussed. So saying, okay, well, what did you control for? We're going to actually ask a lot of questions, company, on what does this represent? Does it represent, what does your representation look like? So there is so much. And then, of course, if you're in industries where your competitors have been disclosing pay data, you're probably already on top of it. That's where we actually get some of our work, Dave, is every once in a while we'll have clients come to us and say, oh no, our competitors started disclosing their pay gap number, or they disclosed their EEO-1 Type 2 reports. We'd like to do the same, but before we do that, we want to make sure we understand what our risk is, or we want to make sure we understand what we look like compared to our competitors. So there's so much pressure. I think it's here to stay. And if we go to the next slide, I'd love to talk a little bit about some additional, I don't want to say pressure, but vehicles for public, sort of pay transparency. And that is the ESG report. And this used to be a sustainability report, used to be a corporate responsibility report. Now we've watched organizations and the World Economic Forum put together standards for the environmental, social, and governance report. And the purpose of this conversation, our focus really is the social component. Really, how does the company improved its social impact, what those social factors are in terms of representation, racial diversity, equality, pay equity. And so what we found is that ESG reports, and there's multiple research studies on this, ESG reports create great value for organizations in the eye of the public. It creates great value in terms of your shareholders, believing in your company and the institution and the priorities of your organization. There's just so much around this in terms of the C-suite. And leveraging that social component and actually taking a step back for your organization, strategically evaluating how you want to comply with your organization's palette for transparency. If you want to follow the World Economic Forum's guidelines on reporting your pay and wage ratios, and how you want to approach that is so important in this conversation. And so what I'm seeing savvy organizations do is, to your point, Dave, before they publish anything, they're doing a lot of behind the scenes attorney-client privilege studies, not only on pay equity, they're doing all of these different wage gap studies that Lisa discussed, kind of looking at adjusted, unadjusted, figuring out what they were controlling for, comparing that to their diversity numbers so they have the comprehensive story in place before they, even a simple statistic that might say 99 cents to the dollar has a whole bunch of research behind it, a lot of evaluation, and really strategic layers of analytics that go into that disclosure. So that's something I just wanted to highlight here as we talk about pay transparency in the ESG era. And I think ESGs are here to stay. And your C-suite, if the folks on the phone are actually asking a lot more questions of EEO professionals, especially in light of this FOIA request, Dave, right? Because now that's making its way to the C-suite. I've seen some of my clients that have been affirmative action professionals now starting to get looped into, oh my gosh, can you pull the AAP data or your EEO1 data so we can put it in our ESG report? Or give us a little feedback on what you're doing with OFCCP so we can make sure we have it in the governance section of your ESG report. So I think this profession is just going to continue to have that exposure to the C-suite because of how important the ESG reports are to organizations.
Yeah, just one comment, Joanne. I think right, employers just really need to think through what they're actually disclosing, right? I mean, I think, right, historically, employers were thinking we're not going to disclose anything. I think that train left the station. I think they are disclosing, but you need to be smart because, employers are getting hit from both sides. They get hit for not doing enough, and then they get hit for doing too much, right? I mean, Starbucks is dealing with a lawsuit now by a class of whites because they think their DE&I initiatives went too far. So, we work with clients to kind of objectively, using data, using analytics to help them not only in their plans but how they disclose. Let's move through the kind of the racial audits that we're seeing. These are really interesting.
Yeah, I'll try to keep it high level, but as a part of some of these ESG initiatives and shareholders initiatives, we have seen an increase in what is called really as a civil rights audit or a racial equity audit. Civil rights is a little more inclusive of a term. But essentially, companies are doing really holistic reviews of their organization policies and practices and data when it comes to racial equity, or holistically at a civil rights perspective, it might be both race and sex or whatever the objective of the study is. But keep in mind, this audit is really holistic. It's qualitative and quantitative. So not only does it look at workplace data, right? Like, what are your promotions? What are your applicants? What does your pay look like? What is your termination? And how are you dealing with this? And what does your data look like? Your HR data. It's comparing that with, it's also looking at like workplace culture, right? It's doing almost like a climate of the engagement of your culture. It's looking at hiring practices, procedures, promotional practices and procedures. What are your policies on paper? And so what's fascinating about these, and we've done several of these actually now, we're getting to this space where we're doing these lovely qualitative and quantitative reviews. And so where we're seeing these come from, either the company is being proactive, and that does happen from time to time, but a lot of times it's because shareholders are putting pressure. There's a vote by shareholders to conduct a civil rights audit, even if the management of the organization doesn't want it. Even if the manager's like, oh, we don't need that, we're good. Shareholders are kind of, in cases, overriding that. And so we've seen some companies that are on the slide here that have undergone this or had their shareholders vote to do one of these civil rights audits. We've also seen these sort of workplace culture reviews or civil rights audits in preparation for litigation. So there's a slew of reasons to do it. Obviously, Dave, to your earlier point, doing it before things get bad, before we get to litigation, is the preference, right? Being proactive and asking, yourself like some tough questions. Being an organization in this case, sometimes you have to be vulnerable to say, how are we doing? What is our report card when it comes to civil rights and racial equity?
Yeah, Joanna, I think you raise a good point though, that it has to be comprehensive. The analogy I give is like you're going to go to the doctor, you're going to get a physical. And the doctor's going to ask you questions. The doctor's going to collect your blood, other things to objectively. And when we have been involved in them, we've kind of leveraged our industrial psychology background, our labor economics background, our HR background to really do a comprehensive audit. And I think that there's a lot of good that comes out of it, just general kind of HR policies and practices, as well as of identifying potential issues. So let's move on to the next to talk about what are some considerations, Joanna, when you're kind of working through these ESG reports.
Oh my goodness, there's so many considerations, Dave. A great question. So an organization is really going to have to figure out where they want to be on their transparency journey and where they have come from on their transparency journey. I know that sounds like really high level and not tangible, but every organization that we've partnered with is a little different, right? Some of our West Coast tech clients might have a very different value system than maybe a manufacturing firm. And so you have to figure out your organization's values and where you're at on that journey first and foremost before we kind of just disclose a number. But some of the components that really hit the EEO community, because there's many components in your ESG reports that are not relevant to our space, right? Think about sustainability, the environment. I'm really focused on the social component and things that hit the EEO community. Things that we're seeing included are like your diversity and inclusion efforts. If your company has like ERGs, those are being talked up in ESG reports. You really got to understand, again, where you're at in that public pay disclosure journey, whether we're disclosing the World Economic Forum's best practices in terms of wage ratio data, and if you're interested in reporting representation of your organization, so meaning the demographics of your organization, we're 60% female, 40% male, et cetera, et cetera. Some organizations have went ahead and published information from their Type 2 EEO1 data. They've taken those 10 EEO categories and published their demographics. Some organizations choose to publish a portion of that. So you got to figure out how transparent do you want to be? How do you want to package that information? Other things that we're seeing in successful ESG reports are discussing the diversity initiatives around hiring and building talent and retaining talent in an organization. What initiatives are those happening, at your HR department or your recruitment team? A couple other things we just talked about, those racial or civil rights or gender equity audits, whether or not your organization is doing that. If you're undergoing one, what are the results? What commitments and actions has your organization taken as a part of the outcome of these racial equity or civil rights audits? And then the last two kind of get a little bit to governance, but we see them both in the social and the governance reporting, depending on how the organization handles this in their ESG report. But actually leveraging those state pay transparency and pay reporting laws in the ESG report can be an advantage to the organization to say, yeah, we did comply. We're working with California on our pay disclosures and our reporting. And so some of that can be considered in your ESG reports. If you've had issues with the OFCCP in the past, you want to make sure you're highlighting all of the achievements in your ESG reports. But there's so many considerations, and I'm just a real quick project management tip, because we've supported many of these. the start of the ESG reporting from an analytical and a strategic perspective starts like as soon as you publish last year's report, right? If you're saying we're going to target to publish in, October of 2022, well, it was really late 2021 where the strategy starts
Yeah.
getting set up, the analysis is discussed. What data do we need to pull? What privilege protocols do we need? So it's like a year-long effort if you really want to do this strategically and want to do it thoughtfully, because you're going to be running a lot of data, either simulations, having a lot of strategic discussions about what do we want to put in this report publicly, and it takes a year to prepare.
All right, thanks, Joanna. We're going to pivot. We go to the next slide. And we can't talk about pay equity without starting to kind of talk about the laws that govern some of the pay equity initiatives, from the federal down to the state. So Lisa, let's kind of start with federal, and I would assume we have some federal contractors on here, and right, OFCCP is a busy agency as it relates to pay equity. So
Sure.
talk us through that.
Happy to. And I think one of the nice switches is, so we do always have to talk about, the regulations around this, but, earlier in my career, clients seem to be most concerned about this. And now they're moving in a direction of being more concerned about it from a diversity perspective. We see the ESG component. And so this is still there and still drives a lot of concern. And so, of course, you should have some information about that. And so there are two major federal agencies that govern anti-discrimination regulations related to pay: the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, in particular Title VII and the Equal Pay Act, and then the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, the OFCCP. And they do govern primarily federal contractors, but a lot of companies are federal contractors, and they have been really focused on pay for the last 5 to 10 years, and that has not subsided. And every couple of years, they revise their kind of guidance around how they're going to conduct compensation audits. But I think the most recent one of the interesting parts about it is that they talk about potentially focusing on the employment practices that may lead to pay differences. So not just looking at the actual differences in, say, base pay or merit pay, but in particular, are there issues with job assignments or steering or promotions that have implications for pay? And so the OFCCP actively audits federal contractors, and that can be a painful spot for companies that aren't prepared for that kind of audit. Next slide. And then on the other side, we have the state pay laws. And so this, as particularly anybody on here who's with a company that operates across the country, since 2016, we have just seen state after state start passing these regulations. And so, some of the big ones are in California, Massachusetts, Oregon, even Puerto Rico. And so, really it feels like every time I look up information about this, someone else has either proposed regulations, amended their regulations, or passed these. And the part about this that employers really need to keep an eye on is that there are differences. So they're not all just one regulation, and mainly they're differing standards. They're different ways to group employees potentially. They're differing factors that could be allowed to be used to, identify why there are pay differences. And so having this patchwork of state laws, particularly for a multi-state employer, can be very time-consuming and very confusing. And so, why is this happening? A lot of speculation is because they haven't passed the Paycheck Fairness Act at the federal level. We have the Equal Pay Act, but it covers gender. And so we don't have this federal regulation that covers race and gender. And so states are taking up the torch and saying, okay, fine, then we'll put our own in place.
Yeah, listen, I think the same thing with reporting. I mean, I think, when the Obama administration put forward the EEOC's Component 2 report, the states were like, okay, the feds are leading on this. Then once the Trump administration rescinded that Component 2 pay disclosure report, I think the states, especially the blue states, were saying, fine, we'll fill that.
I think that's right.
And I think we're going to see that continue. And the patchwork is just really challenging for employers. I mean, we don't have time to talk about Illinois and some of what Illinois is doing, And to your point, right? I mean, more are coming online every day, and the states are getting really active. We're starting to see some litigation coming out of the states.
Yep, and you make a great point that not only are they regulations that, prohibit pay discrimination, but now you're starting to see them kind of come on and say, now we want you to actually report out on this. So, you have to actually report information on pay scales or, pay by bands. And so I think we're going to see that trend continue. I think you're absolutely right across the country where more and more states are requiring that, and trying to navigate all that is going to be troublesome, we'll just say.
Let's go next slide to like what are the general themes that we're seeing, and what are the states trying to accomplish, Lisa?
Yeah, so I think they're trying to accomplish what they feel like the federal government has not done. And so they're really trying to, look at where are barriers, where are issues with pay, what can we do to make a difference here? And so you're seeing not only regulations that prohibit pay discrimination, but there are also other things that are being put into these regulations. And I think, one of the biggest ones is bans on requesting prior salary when somebody comes on. That was very common early in my career. I think it was pretty common for us to use prior salary as a control variable in our
Right.
regressions.
Mhm.
And now you have all of these states saying no, because you could be perpetuating discrimination that may have occurred earlier in somebody's career. And so you're seeing a lot of that. You are seeing, as I'd mentioned earlier, these differences with who should be grouped together. So more, refined definitions of who should be grouped together for purposes of comparing pay, as well as what factors can you include. And so that's another trend that we're seeing. And here we go, the reporting. We're seeing California has passed pay reporting requirements and requiring that employers provide applicants with pay scales. And so we're starting to see all, stuff that hopefully will help to decrease barriers to pay, such as the bans on using prior salary history, calls for more transparency with, publications of pay scales, as well as prohibitions against, retaliating against employees if they ask about pay. So you're seeing a lot of other components of these regulations that I think are, trying to kind of hit at pay equity from different angles. And then there are also states that have safe harbor components, and this provides employers with some risk mitigation. If they conduct a really reasonable pay study, they can actually give themselves some protection legally.
And boy, do we wish OFCCP would offer some sort of safe harbor provision.
Yep.
Provision.
Agreed.
Because I mean, right, the goal is, and we're going to get into this right now, is that if you're proactive and you do a reasonable pay equity study and you find, problems and fix it, you want to feel good about what you did. And then if you're audited by OFCCP, that OFCCP will either follow your playbook and what you did, as long as it's reasonable, or take into consideration what you did. And
Absolutely.
we don't have that right now. So Lisa, let's kind of get into, we've got 15 minutes left. And by the way, if you've got questions, put them in the chat box, and at the end, if we've got questions, we'll save some time to answer them. But this
Sure.
is the most important part, right? Is conducting a proactive pay equity study. And I'm going to get on my soapbox for a second, Lisa, and just say, A, you should do this, and B, you have to do it right. And you need a team of people that has a good understanding of compensation, of data, of statistics, and the law. Because the risk is you do this incorrectly and you make adjustments on the wrong people
That's
for
right.
the wrong reason and miss a problem that exists. So you really have to do it right on your groupings, on your regression modeling, and you also need a lawyer. These
Yes.
studies should be done under privilege. So Lisa, walk us through, conducting this analysis.
Sure. So I think that before you even get started, you really need to sit down and think about, why are we doing this, and what are you going to do with those results? And because it's not uncommon for me to get into a study and suddenly the client is asking questions that are unrelated to what the scope of work is. So in other words, they say, we want a pay equity study. And then I get in there and I realize, oh no, they want a pay gap study.
Yeah.
Or, you know, they want to disclose this information. So I think it's really important to sit down early on with legal and say, what are we going to do with these results? And you don't have to do one. I mean, you can certainly do all of these at the same time. What you have to understand is that depending on what you're going to do, those results, there are going to be differences in how you set up the analysis, in the data you need, potentially in the groupings of employees. So it's really important to understand, is this for state reporting? Because there are going to be very specific requirements for that. Are we trying to anticipate what the OFCCP might find? So we want to make sure we model the analysis similar to what we know the OFCCP does. Are we going to publicly disclose this? And so then we want to be very careful about how we conduct that analysis and decide what information we're going to share. Or is this proactive to really dig in and say, do we have any systemic pay equity issues? And so again, the steps are the same for most of these, you know, reasons, but you really have to understand, why are we doing this and what are we going to do with the results, because that's really going to affect the data, the process, and the analyses.
Yeah, one quick point, Lisa, right on the last bullet, we're starting to see more of our clients doing not only domestic, but international.
Yep.
The international studies, they'll limit just to sex, because that's really the data that they have. But there are nuances to doing some of these international studies.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Next slide. I think you skipped one. And this ties into kind of what we were just talking about. So, you know, what questions are you trying to ask? Because as I mentioned earlier, you know, the OFCCP is kind of moving in this direction of saying, you know, it's not just base salary and potentially differences in base salary that you may be looking at, but you also need to think about, do we want to look at those practices that could lead to pay discrimination? So another important part of this kind of setting the stage is, you know, what do you want to do for pay equity purposes? Do you just want to limit that to looking at, say, base salary, or are you also interested in looking at some of those practices that underlie pay? And so again, different kinds of studies, but you need to have some awareness of that and be thinking about that. And it's not uncommon to do a pay equity study and then after that say, hey, yeah, this makes me think we really need to look at starting salary, or we really need to look at our performance ratings. So again, you can kind of, you know, align those at different times, but it is something you need to be thinking about when you're getting started in this. Next slide. And so there are a couple of major components to conducting a pay study. And one of the biggest ones is, how are we going to group employees for purposes of this analysis? And so this is where those state regulations really come into play, because there's slightly different definitions for an appropriate grouping depending on the regulation you're looking at. And so I've listed just a handful here. So Equal Pay Act focuses on people who work on jobs that require equal skill, effort, and responsibility with similar working conditions. Under California Pay Act, you should group employees who conduct substantially similar work. Under Title VII, you should group employees who are similarly situated. And so you can see there are nuanced differences. You need to be aware of those, but in essence, you want to think about, based on job content, who's performing the same kinds of work, requiring, and I am going to go back to a couple of these, the same types of skills, efforts, levels of responsibility. And so that's a really important part of conducting an analysis. And it's not always job title. You know, we've had court cases that pretty consistently have said job title is not the end all be all. You need to show that people are performing the same kinds of work if you're going to use that. And there are some companies who may be able to group more broadly than job title. So it's a really important part of conducting a pay study.
Yeah, Lisa, you know, just a couple points here. I mean, I think this is such an important part of when you do your study of how are you going to group your employees together. You don't want to look at the whole company together. You don't want to go, you know, so narrow that you can't run any meaningful analysis. So it's this art and more than it is science. And you really do need to get this right. So my advice to everybody on the call, the first year that you're going to do this, spend some time thinking about how you're going to group your employees together for that unit of analysis for your study.
Absolutely. Next slide. And then the second kind of big item of discussion when you're getting ready to conduct these studies is, okay, we've identified how we're going to group employees, but what are the merit factors that influence pay that we want to control for? Because those could explain pay differences. So everybody who's in a similar job isn't going to be paid the same. There could be other factors. And we've got some listed here, whether that be they've been promoted recently, it could be tenure, such as time in company or time in grade, performance. Quite often, if you're a pay performance company, do you have performance ratings that we can incorporate because performance should be aligned to pay? So these are the kind of things you want to sit down and really think about. What do our policies say? What do we know happens in practice? And then the other key component is in figuring out, do we have data that measures these factors, which is often a big concern. A lot of these, yes, you'll see a big question mark by previous relevant experience, age question mark, because everybody says we pay for prior relevant experience. No one ever has any data on that. And so there is the possibility that you could create a proxy for some of these factors, such as age for prior experience. But so those are really the two biggest parts before you start that study: grouping employees, factors that should influence pay, and related to that, do we have the data to measure all of those things?
Yeah, and just one point, Lisa, right? So when you're talking about these salary predictors or factors, right, these are things we're going to control for in the regression analysis.
Right.
So that's the kind of the gold standard for these types of analytics.
Yep,
is look, are there meaningful differences? And if there are meaningful differences, can they be explained statistically through legitimate non-discriminatory factors? Just really fast, we got a question here. Someone said, we've got 1,500 employees and about 75% of our employees are now remote and scattered, and we have geographic differentials. That makes it challenging. How do we handle that? Well, here's the good news. You can see on Lisa's slide, statistically, you can control for things like geographic differentials, either by a market midpoint, if it differs by a geographic, or actually putting in that differential in the regression. So very common, right? More common now, kind of. I don't know, are we post-COVID? I don't know where we are, but this remote workforce and the differentials can be accounted for.
Yep, absolutely. Geographic differential is a very common control factor, and a lot of companies are struggling with this as they have a lot more employees who suddenly are remote, and maybe they're moving different places. So the other component of that is, I think, sitting down to talk about how are we going to handle that, what's our policy going to be, and making sure you apply that consistently. Next slide. As quickly as I can on this one, I think the point of this slide is really that there is a tendency for employers to conduct a pay equity analysis. They run regressions, they identify groups where there are disparities, and they say, let's just make adjustments. And that can be problematic. And so the case that's listed here is a case where New Haven Fire Department used an assessment for promotion purposes. Before it used it in the promotion process, it discovered that it had a disparate impact against Blacks. So Blacks were not passing it as much as whites or Hispanics. And so the fire department said, we're not going to use the assessment then. And so the white and Hispanic firefighters sued New Haven, saying, you can't do that. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court held that New Haven shouldn't do that unless they had a strong basis in evidence that using that assessment would have subjected to liability, then they were in the wrong. And so I think the main point here is, if you run a regression, if you run that analysis, there's still a little work to do. One is you need to make sure that model is robust. So you have appropriate groupings, you feel like the merit factors are reasonable, business related, valid merit factors. But also, as I pointed out early, it's very common to not have every factor controlled for, whether it's because you don't have data on it or not reliable data. And so because of that, there's always a component of, let's look at these groups first and make sure we can't identify merit-related variables, factors that explain these differences, and do that work before you start making salary adjustments, because just making the adjustments can put you at risk.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate, go back to my soapbox, how we started this section, but this is why you have to do it right. This is why you need subject matter experts, because once again, you want to make, if you're going to make adjustments, you want to make it on the right people for the right reason. We see these software programs out there that says just throw your data in, it'll run a quick and dirty model, and then you're going to make these wholesale changes to salary across the board. It's not a good idea from a legal standpoint, Lisa, as you've demonstrated here. It's also not good because it could throw off your compensation system. So if you're going to make equity adjustments, you've got to have a good model that's well thought out. Okay,
Absolutely.
we've got about 5 minutes left. Let's
one more slide up for me,
yeah.
and then I'm going to hand
Joanna
it off again.
Yep.
So let's say you do get to that point where you feel like you've explained all the differences you can, and we still have some pay disparities. I'm not going to go through each of these, but the main point is they're different strategies for making those adjustments. And so it's another discussion point. So I think one thing is realizing when you do a pay equity study, it's going to take some time on your part to participate in the study, in the discussions, in the investigation, and to really think out what is the approach we're going to take to making these salary adjustments.
And I'll just make one plug. We wrote an entire paper on this, on how to make salary adjustments. If you're interested in reading that paper, reach out. We can get you a copy of that. But really, with your lawyer, you need to really think through this process. Who's going to get it? How much? When? How is it communicated? And then Joanna, the last piece. Okay, so let's say we do this study. We've got our groupings. We got our regression. We make salary adjustments. We're not done.
Yeah,
What's next?
great question. So if we go to the next slide, table stakes is do your annual pay equity study, make adjustments where appropriate to Lisa's mitigation strategies. But here's the thing, we can do an annual, and we should be doing an annual pay equity study year over year, making appropriate adjustments to adjust for past decisions that may have been made. But the reality is you want to start to get at the root cause. If we are finding pay differences year over year, we want to try to correct the behaviors that may have led to these pay differences, whether they were bad decisions, whether in starting salary or job assignment or some sort of unconscious bias. So doing a pay equity analysis is kind of table stakes, but doing more holistic reviews, a little bit like we talked about some of the audits earlier, but doing a holistic review of your HR policies and practices to determine why those differences may have been occurring year over year. To my point, is it a performance management process or a merit increase process issue? Is it a policy or starting salary issue? We actually really need to do some work to understand that at a holistic level to get at that root cause so that we're trying to mitigate pay equity issues as we go along, not only just adjust for the ones that currently exist. And so a lot of organizations don't actually want to do this, Dave. They're like, okay, we did our annual pay equity study, check the box, let's just do it year over year or throw it in year over year. But if we want to get to that root cause, doing a little bit more work in the HR space to do analytics and even ask qualitative questions, maybe focus groups with employees, reviewing those policies and procedures, understanding your workplace culture is a really great investment for an organization for all of the reasons we talked about earlier in the presentation with public transparency, ESG, and then also it's just the right thing to do for us to kind of mitigate that root cause going forward. So I know we had some questions, and I want to make sure we got to the last bit of questions, though. Dave, did you have anything else to add?
I'm good.
Oh, go ahead, Angel.
Yes, Joanna. So many of the questions were everybody's very interested in receiving that white paper. So we will share that in the email follow-up. Before we get to, there's a couple questions, and we only have about 1 minute left. I do want to launch a quick poll to ensure that those on the call, if you're interested in learning more about Circa's OFCCP compliance and diversity recruiting solutions, as well as DCI Consulting Services. DCI is a great partner of Circa. They help organizations solve their most complex human resource challenges. They use a data-driven approach. They partner with clients to address organizational challenges holistically while helping them to mitigate their risks. So if you would like more information about pay equity or their consulting services, we invite you to please fill out our poll and they can contact you directly. So a couple questions came through and I hope I can get to some of them. I'm going to get to at least one. The biggest one is always, will I receive the slides? Everyone will receive the video recording along with your certificates, along with the white paper that David was referencing. And if there's any other resources that you're looking for, there will be contact information within that email that you can utilize. Now, one question that just came in, and I'm reading this on the fly, so hopefully we can answer it. Being a federal contractor, there are different budgets assigned per contract for each position. Parities may exist due to the various contracts. How can this be included in the analysis?
Yeah, absolutely. And this kind of reminds me of union employees who are under a collective bargaining unit. You absolutely want to make sure you account for that. And so if it's a situation where that really does dictate the pay, then most of our clients will actually not include those because there's no employer discretion. So it's a great point, whether it be, because they're under a specific, contract within your company that dictates the pay, or if it's a union contract where the collective bargaining agreement dictates the pay. Those are situations where the employer may not have discretion, and then a pay equity study may not be appropriate there.
Thank you, Lisa. So that is all the time that we have for today. I want to thank, on behalf of Circa, David, Joanna, and Lisa for your wealth of information on pay equity in 2022. It's ever changing, it's intense. Thank you for simplifying it. I thank everyone for joining us today. I wish you all a great rest of your day. So
Thank
thank you very much.
Thanks all.